Hi everyone, it's Mr. Sinti, and today I have the pleasure to discuss with you the anatomy of a special kind of cell called a neuron. A neuron is one of a few different types of nerve cells that are present in nerve tissue, but it's kind of your basic, kind of your classic cell. And I think if we can understand some of the fundamental anatomy of the neuron, in other words, its basic structure, and understanding some of those ideas, it'll build up a scaffolding to understand more complex things that we're really possibly interested in, which is how do nerve cells communicate with other cells because they are capable of that. It's most remarkable. Nerve cells, as you can see from this picture right here, let me just jump right into the discussion. As you can see, these two cells right here, these are two neurons, and it looks as if they're sort of tangled up together. But indeed, neurons never really come in direct contact with one another, but they do communicate. It's kind of interesting. So it's a special kind of cell. It's able to send an electrical impulse down its body. It's able to communicate with other neurons. It's capable of communicating with other tissue in general. It's able to talk to glands. It's able to talk to muscle. And ultimately, it's what you're doing right now by watching me and by listening to me and hopefully understanding some of the things that we're talking about because the brain is composed by millions and billions, I should say, billions of neurons. And it's a most remarkable type of cell. And so let's get into that. 100 billion cells in the brain. And so it's a sort of an atypical looking cell. One, if you haven't noticed it already, one of the things about it that's kind of typical is the fact that it has, cytoplasm right in here. It has a nucleus. But do you see its cell membrane right here is extended and branched? So it has a tremendous amount of branching like a tree. And all of these extensions that come off of this main cell body right here are called dendrites, from the word meaning branches and trees. So we have dendrites, and you may not understand this completely, but I'll just say it anyway. This is the message that nerves are communicating are go in one direction. So they're received by the dendrite. Even though you may not understand what that means, the message is received by the dendrite and it travels down this long extension right here, like a cord from the cell body called the axon. And the axon is incredibly long and incredibly thin. It can be upwards to like a foot long or many feet, depending on the organism that you're dealing with. But indeed, they're several centimeters at the very minimum, switching between metric and Old English units, but it's a very, very long cell. And so, as it turns out, where one neuron touches another one, you can see here at the very end, it's not in direct contact with the dendrite. So the axon is coming in contact with the dendrite of another neuron down below here, but it doesn't actually touch. But where the axon comes in contact with the dendrite of another cell is called the synapse. So the place where two things come together. It's kind of like the meeting of the minds. Like if you and a friend are in agreement, you can say that you're in a synapse. You're coming together on that. And what's happening is there's little vesicles, which are membrane containing units that carry chemicals that actually bud off from the axon and travel the synapse and interact with the next cell's membrane. And so these little red chemicals are called neurotransmitter, and more to come on all of this in a separate podcast. So again, what we were talking about before, that information flow in a neuron is directional. It comes in via the dendrite, and this in aqua blue right here is the axon terminal, so the end of the axon of a different neuron. So many neurons can be communicating with this cell. So the message is picked up by the dendrites. Here's the nucleus in the cell body. Lots of mitochondria in there. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And then the nerve impulse travels down the axon, and again, it reaches the axon terminal, and then the neurotransmitter travels from across the synapse, this cleft right here, to the next dendrite of another neuron. So this is let me circle it, this is the axon here, and this is the axon here. So what's happening here and here are the same thing. The neurotransmitter is traveling right in there and right there as well. So more detailed drawing of this, but same thing, neuron. Here are the dendrites, incredibly branching right here, so messages are received. Here's the nucleus. Here's the cell body, the main body of the cell. And where this part, where the cell body connects to the axon, is referred to the axon hillock. And though that may seem detailed at the moment, it's important because we're going to talk about in a separate podcast how the action potential, which is the nerve impulse, begins to be generated in this region in particular. And then the axon, interesting enough, is covered by these interesting cells. Do you see here? They sort of remind me of a child's water wings, that when you're learning to swim, you have these blow-up structures that wrap around your arms. And it's a type of cell called a Schwann cell. Okay, so anatomy comes strong. Don't fear. It's just a name. It's a Schwann cell. And what's interesting is here's the nucleus of the Schwann cell. It reminds me analogously of a tube of toothpaste. If you had, like for example, if you had like a pencil like this would be the axon. And if you had a tube of toothpaste and you just kept wrapping it around and around and around and around, it'd be really thick. And so what this Schwann cell does is it wraps itself around, and the membrane of cells, as you may know, are composed of lipids. And so this particular type of lipid is called myelin. And so this myelin sheath wraps around and wraps around, wraps around, wraps around, and it provides insulation. And what we'll talk about a little bit later is the fact that the nerve impulse travels a lot faster when neurons have Schwann cells wrapped around and these myelin sheath, because the nerve impulse jumps between them, sort of leapfrogs these cells. And then ultimately, the node is in between the Schwann cells. And French scientist Ranvier was the first person to identify this, and so therefore nodes of Ranvier. So the nerve impulse travels from the axon hillock down the axon. You can have branches coming off of it, not just one axon. You can have more networking if there's more branches coming off your axon. And so sometimes we call those axon collaterals. Collateral, meaning to the side. And so here we have a collateral coming off to the side here. Here's the axon, and then here is the terminal right here, or the knob, where the neurotransmitter vesicles are located. And they're called the synaptic knob because it's going to be in contact with a dendrite of another neuron, which might be over here, for example. Okay, so I like this picture a lot. This is an actual photograph of the dendrites. Look at how extended they are. So it's a real networking kind of thing. And so think of the brain kind of like as the original internet, where there's so many connections and links between one idea and another. And so this is the way it all works. The neurons connect to one another via these dendrites. They can receive a tremendous amount of incoming signals in this direction. So dendrites receive incoming messages. And so they do that because the axon terminal drops off neurotransmitter, and then the dendrites are going to receive that. I won't get into that conversation, but it's really cool. I will in a separate video, and how the neurotransmitter comes across the synapse and is picked up by the dendrite. And so one part here receives the signal, okay, that's the dendrite, and another part generates it, which is, here's the cell body, here's the nucleus. So this part right over here, the axon hillock, if you remember, generates the action potential, and then it goes, whoa, down the axon like that in one direction. And so, again, another awesome picture here of the cell body and all the extended dendrites and all these tangles. Imagine what this looks like inside the brain. It's quite remarkable. And so each neuron has a region called the axon hillock, and the axon hillock is located right there. In other words, where the cell body extends into the axon. And then all these axon collaterals, again, come off the sides like this. This, you know, axon collaterals. And at their end, they can branch into thousands of different axon terminals. I'll just draw a few, but there's thousands. Can you imagine? So a lot of networking is happening inside the brain. And so there's all kinds of studies. I'm tempted to go into more things. All kinds of studies looking at neurons under the microscope of individuals that have been stimulated by a lot of reading in their life and a lot of storytelling and a lot of experiences, and they have just so many more branchings in their neurons, because their neurons are like roots. They continue to grow out, and more connections and are made the more reading you do, more experiences that you have. It's quite remarkable. And so neurons are excitable, meaning that they can communicate, and through an action potential. More to talk about this later. But they don't just talk, I mentioned this before, they just don't talk to other nerves. They can talk to a muscle, for example. So here's a typical muscle fiber, which is called a muscle cell. And here's some blood vessel right here. And so it doesn't, remember, come in direct contact, although it looks like these little fingers of a salamander touching the muscle. They don't actually come in contact. So here's the axon terminal. Here are the synaptic vesicles that contain neurotransmitter, and this is the synapse. And notice here how the sarcoplasmic, the sarcolemma, which is the membrane of the muscle cell, is invaginated here, and there's like convolutions, like little villi, in order to receive even more of the neurotransmitter. Isn't that remarkable? So there's more surface area to receive even more messages. And so what's interesting is you can see the myofibrils composed inside the muscle cell. And here's the mitochondria, and here's the sarcoplasmic reticulum that holds the calcium. You may recall that one of the things that happens is when the neurotransmitter interacts with the muscle cell, that's what stimulates the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release calcium, which is a regulatory ion which interacts with some regulatory proteins like troponin and then tropomyosin, which frees the active sites so that the myosin cross bridges can pull on the filaments, shortening the length of the sarcomere, and therefore the muscle contracts. So not just can nerves interact with muscle, but they can interact with glands as well. In other words, I could see something, I could be scared by something that's happening, and like, for example, if I discover that there's a fire, and the nerves can connect to my adrenal glands and release epinephrine, and so that will initiate a response as well. So nerves can connect with glands, they can connect with other nerves and other tissues such as muscle. And so again, this is a cool picture under the light microscope showing a typical neuron. Here's the cell body. Here are the dendrites that are extending out right here. And then this is a good picture of the axon hillock. You can see it right there. It's sort of this connection area between the cell body and the axon. There's two neurons here. And so that's where the action potential is generated. The signals are received by the dendrite. It goes down the axon and then this way in one direction. And so again, the action potential is generated at the hillock, which is right here, the axon hillock. Here's the nucleus right here. It kind of looks like the eye of a hurricane, but it's the nucleus of the neuron. These are the dendrites located up here. Here's the axon. Here's a back away photograph of this. Notice the collaterals coming off to the side. Here's the cell body and many, many dendrites. So pretty cool. Scanning electron micrograph. You can really see the cell bodies are much larger. Here's the hillock region right in here. And then you can also see the dendrites and axons all sort of tangled around like this. Pretty cool. And then I mentioned before, some neurons have Schwann cells that are surrounding them with these myelin sheaths. making them rather thick, sort of like water wings. And so these neurons tend to be white when observed under the microscope because of all the lipids. And they help to speed up the signal that travels down the axon. And so again, here's another diagram of that. It's one cell that's just wrapped and wrapped and wrapped around, and so in the end it acts as insulation. Kind of like an analogous would be, I mentioned toothpaste, but it's a little weird, but maybe it's like the plastic that surrounds a wire, like in an electrical cord. It's insulating it because it's the axon that's going to be carrying an electrical signal. Okay, so that might be a little bit better of an analogy. And then this is a cross-section showing here's the axon of the neuron right over here, and then this is all the myelin sheath that surround it. And you can see how axons have these little puffs right here of Schwann cells, and then in between them are the nodes of Ranvier again, the gaps. And then you can actually see these gaps under the microscope, and it helps to speed up the signal. And so that's pretty interesting, I think. Take a look at this. This is a really interesting animation here. It's really brief, showing three-dimensionally how intricate the dendrites are in a neuron. That's pretty cool. And then over here, you can see this is a cool animation as well, showing that the nerve impulse is received by the dendrites. Let me see if you can see that again. So the nerve impulse is coming down, it's picked up by the dendrite, and then you can see here a close-up of the cell body. The nucleus is in here, mitochondria, all the organelles, most of the organelles are contained in here. And then here's the axon hillock. This is a little preview because what we really want to talk about is how an action potential is generated and how signals are received and how the whole neuron functions. And it's all going to come down to a discussion of the neuronal membrane. It's all going to come down to the membrane. And so as you can see in this picture, I'll mention resting potential in a moment. This is a close-up of the membrane. And so you might be familiar with this, maybe not, but I'll get into it a little bit later, a little foreshadowing. The membrane is really cool. The membrane is a combination of a phospholipid bilayer and embedded proteins. And these proteins do a whole bunch of different things. But we're going to get into a conversation about ion channels, which are helping to pass ions across the cell membrane because the phospholipid bilayer is impermeable normally to ions because they're electrically charged. So I hope you enjoyed this basic conversation of the anatomy of a neuron. Thanks for watching.